asking the questions mainstream journalists will never ask. This is your Richie Allen Show on richieallen.co.uk, Fab Radio 2 in Manchester, and triggerwarning.tv.
Let's welcome back to the programme. I'm delighted that he pops in and joins us regularly. He's a terrific geopolitical analyst and historian. He's been seen everywhere, Press TV, RT, Sputnik, and many others. Veterans for Peace in his time as well. Let's welcome back to the show our own Scott Rickard. Scott, welcome back. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me back, Richie.
Thanks for coming on. Delighted that you do come on so often. We're proud to have you on. You've been in the Far East recently, by the way. Tell us about that. What were you doing out there?
Well, I was just vacationing, but I got to tell you, and actually running into some old colleagues as well. But I had a good time to go out and meet a lot of people and basically do a lot of personal investigation on historical events in Thailand and Malaysia. Spent most of my time in Thailand, but came across some interesting stories that I had some interest in and some history on, especially the Jim Thompson story. I don't know how familiar you are with him, but definitely a guy who was much like Graham Fuller and the work he did in the Caspian Sea. Jim Thompson did quite a bit of work in Thailand for the CIA post-World War II and was very instrumental in not only developing the silk industry, but also developing the opium trade out of Burma through Thailand alongside the CIA and the U.S. military.
That sounds fascinating. I don't know very much about that, Scott. That's something that we should maybe cover in a future programme. I didn't mention in the introduction, I should have done, Scott's a former linguist at the National Security Agency. Hence, he's in very high demand to provide geopolitical analysis in a lot of places. Delighted that he's back on. A couple of things that we have to get into, Israel being one of them. You may have noticed today, Scott, you might not, but a cartoonist at the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung was fired today because he drew a caricature of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, the cartoon wasn't in any way racist. It wasn't in any way defamatory. It was referencing what happened in Gaza during the Nakba remembrance, of course, but also referencing the Eurovision Song Contest. There was a Twitter storm, apparently, and this 85-year-old cartoonist has been fired. You've been covering this a long time. You've been watching it. I suppose you're not surprised, Scott, that somebody is critical of Benjamin Netanyahu, even though it's mild criticism, and he loses his job.
Well, unfortunately, this has been the status quo, not just with this cartoonist, but obviously several cartoonists have been fired for similar purposes, when in fact you're looking at a extremely hypocritical role here when you talking about Israel. If there was a concentration camp of 2 million people in the world today that was filled with people of the Jewish faith, and the average age was 19, and half of the people were under the age of 18, I think you'd see quite a outcry globally for the freedom of those people being held.
Right, Scott is just breaking up a bit on us there.
A concentration camp, or what I refer to as the Gaza.
The reception is pretty bad there, so I'll tell you what we're going to do. We'll just briefly disconnect there and reconnect, and hopefully we'll get Scott back and it'll sound a bit better than that. There was a bit of background noise there, but it was okay. We could hear him pretty well, but there was quite a bit of background noise there on the call, which was a bit disconcerting. So I know he's on a hands-free device in Florida there, so I'm calling him back. We'll give him a second. In fact, I'll ask him to call me. That might be the way to go about it. This is the Richie Allen Show, by the way. It is exactly 13 minutes past the hour. Scott Rickard is our guest. He's in Tampa in Florida. There was a wee bit of scratchiness on the call there. It was dropping in and out, so I've just disconnected it, and hopefully we'll be able to get him back in a second. Rightio, he's typing to me now. There might be a problem. So in the meantime, we'll take some music. This is pretty bizarre, this. Eh? This is taking you back. Way back.
Love is in the air. Everywhere I look around. Love is in the air. Every sight and every sound. And I don't know if I'm being foolish, don't know if I'm being wise, but it's something that I must believe in, and it's there when I look in your eyes. Love is in the air, in the whisper of the trees.
Right, as brilliant as John Paul Young is, we'll cut him short because I think we've got Scott back, and it might be a better line. Sorry about that, Scott. Welcome back.
Hey, so sorry about that. Skype on the mobile is not so good.
No problems. It sounds considerably better now, so it's good. Yeah, we were talking about the perils of criticising the Israeli government and the German cartoonist being fired, 85 years old. He wouldn't apologise for it. He stuck to his guns. And you were talking, you were basically responding to that. So we'll start there again, Scott. Go ahead.
Well, basically, what it comes down to is, given the turn of events, as if the Israelis were 2 million in population with an average age of 19 years old in an open air prison, or the Gaza ghetto, as I like to refer to it as, very much like the Warsaw ghetto. These people are in their own country and have also been unfortunately put down for now 70 years. I like to call it the crystal Nakba. If you want to really refer to what's happened here in Israel, they've turned around and acting just like their captors under Nazi Germany. And it is absolutely an apartheid state, and this is unfortunate that they have such influence on media industry and on our political infrastructure that you really can't speak badly about any of the political affairs, or you're considered something, as they're referring to this cartoonist, as an anti-Semite. I have been labeled an anti-Semite by the Anti-Defamation League in the United States, and they refuse to respond to any of my mail or any of my emails or my phone calls. And certainly don't give me a chance to defend myself in any way whatsoever. So I think what we see here is a very unfortunate event where you have tremendous amounts of influence on media and political infrastructure that is absolutely biased and certainly not open-minded and not thoughtful in any way whatsoever of the victims in this scenario, where we have literally millions that have suffered for decades in Palestine, and also certainly the refugees in the surrounding countries. So this is an incredibly unfortunate event in human history, and sadly it is not uncommon. Certainly Great Britain has been responsible for it, for famines that they caused in Bengal, famines that they caused in Ireland, and certainly the United States has been responsible for it, for just a multitude of deaths in Africa, Southeast Asia, and even the Korean Peninsula. So this is a sad, as well as the indigenous people of the North American continent, the millions that died in that genocide as well. It's a sad state of affairs. It's unfortunately very common with the human race, and sadly the white really genocidal colonialism continues today.
And the Gaza thing, of course, I shouldn't say that. I don't mean the Gaza thing, but the conditions in Gaza, our refusal to deal with Israel, as in our government's refusal to deal with what is a pariah state, they love to use the word regime to describe any government they don't like. I was watching Sky News today again and the BBC. They kept referring to Tehran as the regime, this nonsense. The real regime in the region is in Israel. But Scott, on the punishment for criticising them, you might not be aware, you might be, but in the last couple of hours, the former mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, who for many years has been a Labour Party very outspoken critic of the Israeli regime and the Israeli crimes, Ken Livingstone a couple of years ago mentioned that there was a time when Hitler supported Zionism, which is true. Of course, the Havre Agreement, 1933, whatever it was. But that's caused a lot of problems for Livingstone in the last couple of years. And today, he has left the Labour Party, saying that even though he was right to cite the historic events of 1933, it's probably best for the Labour Party if I leave. And the Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has come out and said, oh yeah, it's for the best. But Scott, what he said was factually accurate. How dangerous is it when people make historically accurate statements and then have to leave their jobs or leave their parties just to keep people happy and just to appease the Israeli regime? These are tyrannical times, Scott.
Well, they're not tyrannical times. If you look at history, unfortunately, they've been pretty much status quo since really the emergence of Zionism in the late 1800s, and then the dominance after the support for the Bolsheviks and the Kazakhs and their overthrow of the Tsars. So you've had the relationship between the Zionist entity, which is nothing more than the political infrastructure that emerged out of Odessa, Ukraine, and now has become a dominant player in the financial, political, and media infrastructures around the world. And, I'm very disappointed in Jerry Corbyn. In the past, he was much like George Galloway. He was very outspoken of the apartheid regime in Israel. So I would say, shame on you, Jeremy, for, saying it would be the right thing to do. Certainly in the past, Jeremy Corbyn has been far the reasonable and factual operations on the ground. In fact, he even worked for a short stint for Press TV in the past. Don't forget that. Just very much like George Galloway. So I'm very disappointed that Jeremy Corbyn would come out and say something like that. It's discouraging that once you become a member of the elite political infrastructure, you become far more soft-core Zionist than you should. And I think people do that as a way to not only further their political careers, but also to gain momentum on agendas that they'd like to complete in their during their term. And sadly, it's a huge sacrifice to sacrifice your honor and and certainly I would consider the personal endeavors of individuals to be truthful and seek justice for all. That's pretty much what I stand for. Obviously, in the United States and certainly even in countries that I do support, that most people are against, Iran and other countries, when they do wrong, obviously everyone should be held accountable.
That's a really good thing to say, Scott. Thanks for that. Scott Rickard is our guest. He's live on the line from Florida. It's interesting you said that about Iran, because there are things, Scott, that happen in countries like Iran that I wouldn't be thrilled about, that I wouldn't be happy about. Yet I've been making programs like this for about 10, 12 years now. Before that, I was mainstream reporter, mainstream producer. And Iran is no threat to the security of the region. Iran is no threat to peace anywhere. It hasn't attacked any country for hundreds of years. In fact, Iran has been the victim. It was the victim of a coup in 1953. It was the victim of the Iraq-Iran war, when the American regime gave weapons to the Iraqis to try and destroy Iran with. But of course, there are things that happen in Iran, human rights issues that we shouldn't ever ignore. And maybe in the past, some journalists, so-called independent journalists, have supported Iran, but have not been prepared to acknowledge that there's no such thing as a dystopia. There's no such thing as a perfect country. It's good to hear that. With respect to what we saw, last week, and the mass murder of Palestinians using these horrendous bullets, these snipers killing these people, I don't want to sound negative, but isn't it just another example of Israel committing mass murder? And they're just going to get away with it, Scott, right? Who's going to stand up to the plate and say enough's enough? We've got to sanction this regime back to the Stone Age. I don't see it happening. Over to you.
Well, I don't see it happening either. Obviously, the most outspoken individual is Erdogan from Turkey, but at the same time, he's not putting his money where his mouth is. They still, Turkey does around $350 billion worth of trade with Israel, and Turkey could easily put their money where their mouth is and basically boycott and stop all businesses. All they've done is really whitewashed the issue and appeasing the Islamists in Turkey by basically cutting off diplomatic ties. Certainly, that's nothing compared to economic ties when we look at the success of bringing down apartheid in South Africa. But I mean, to further, when you look at the issue here, to further the statement with Iran, you really have a country that is a good example of the kinds of diplomatic corruption. You brought up the overthrow of Mossadegh, but you can go all the way back to the 1800s under Reuters, and this is very significant because Reuters also put a puppet in place in the 1800s and bought all the natural resources. This was before the founding of oil and the beginning of the what became the British petroleum industry. And this is a very serious event that people really need to realize, is that not only was Reuters very significant in manipulating the media since the print set typewriters came out, or printers came out, you also have someone who's also been very significant at controlling natural resources for now almost a full 200 years when it comes to the petroleum industry. But certainly prior to that, there were the wood industry was extremely important to the world economy at the time. So it's really economic warfare that continues today. And that economic warfare is the only thing that has really been effective in overthrowing regimes. And if you really want to overthrow the United States government's really hegemony in the region, you have to get global consensus on the economic hitmen that could actually happen. That in the United States, we're talking about players. Even today, the country of India is doing a tit for tat with American tariffs on Indian steel and Indian aluminum. The country of India has decided that they're going to put tariffs on American products going into India. So these are minor steps. But when it comes to the major steps, unfortunately, India, much like the United States, is very tied to the British Empire, very much like Israel as well. These are really extensions of the success of the British Empire, and they are absolutely constricted by the financial, I'd say, dominance of the Western banking infrastructure. This is only a 250-year-old system. It certainly dominates all the NATO partners and their allies, and they maintain a financial sort of upper hand against the BRICS nations or any nation that operates outside of that banking infrastructure. And that's the economic side of this that really controls our politicians. I mean, our politicians are really nothing more than puppets. Certainly in the United States, the American politicians and the ones we've elected really haven't represented the American people in well over 150 years. because of the types of relationships that the financial institutions took over with the American political system. And certainly England's not immune to that either.
Do you go along with Dean Henderson? I know you know Dean. Dean is, like yourself, he's a regular guest.
Fantastic.
He's a lovely guy, Dean. By the way, just to catch up with our listeners who might be just joining the programme, yes, you are listening to Scott Rickard on the line from Florida. Terrific to have Scott back on. He is a former NSA linguist. He's a historian. His knowledge of geopolitical history is astonishing, even to a history graduate like myself. I think he's brilliant. Not only that, but he's a regular contributor to many media organisations. Dean reckons, I mean, we're talking about the financial elites that have been controlling things through the ages. Do you go along with Dean that all roads lead to the city of London? When it comes
certainly London has been massively influential for the last 500 years. Prior to that, you have to go obviously to Rome and Prussia. I'm one of these people that believe the war between the Romans and the Prussians never really ended. It just diversified, and they combined their efforts alongside the French to basically disintegrate the Spanish. At this point, you had a bit of participation more recently between Italy and the I would say the Prussian side has always been certainly the northeastern Europeans, and certainly the Russians. But at the same time, these were some of the most successful battle-hardened warriors in the history of Europe, alongside the Germans. The Germans and the Prussians, obviously, when they combined efforts because of their efforts against the Russians, they certainly had a good effort at that. If you look at the Polish Empire and how successful it was as well. So obviously, when you're talking about the all roads lead to London, we're really only talking about the last 5 centuries, and certainly when it comes to what they call now in the intelligence community the Five Eyes, these are the key players of the London financiers that think about it. The United States. We have the largest borrower in the history of the world, but at the same time, we're the largest manufacturer of weapons and the largest consumer and obviously the largest distributor in the history of the world. The Third Reich couldn't hold a candle to what the United States are doing, and obviously the United States did it with the help of Third Reich, given the influence of all the engineers and certainly all the scientists and all of the intelligence community that the United States imported under Operation Paperclip when they brought in all of the former Third Reich, Nazi Germany professionals to assimilate into the American military and intelligence infrastructure.
And it never went away.
We really have. Go ahead.
No, sorry to butt in. The Third Reich, of course, never went away. It never disintegrated. It just changed shape.
The United States is basically the Fourth Reich.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Scott Rickard is our...
Alongside the British, though.
Alongside the British. Scott Rickard is our guest. Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela has won another 6-year term. Obviously, the foreign offices of the United States and of the United Kingdom are saying they don't recognise his election success. There are 2 trains of thought on Venezuela, on Chavez and on Maduro. Mine is obvious, but the 2 trains of thought are: one, Venezuela is a basket case, the leaders are crazy, this is proof that socialism doesn't work. And the other train of thought is, of course, that external dark and deep forces have basically sought to destroy the possibility of success in Venezuela. Which is true, Scott?
Well, they're both true. I mean, obviously, when it comes to, the concept of socialism or capitalism or any kind of financial infrastructure, it really comes down to the corruption of the government. If you look at the same time, the outside influences and, the kinds of activities that the United States and their allies have conducted, not only in Venezuela, but certainly Ukraine, obviously Syria, it can go many horrific ways. It can go from the economic sanctions that have crippled nations in the past. Certainly the economic sanctions against Venezuela have been massively effective at causing failure in any economic infrastructure they're trying to conduct. Certainly any kind of cooperation from the West when it comes to economic conditions with massive loans, military aid, certainly cooperative business infrastructure. Countries like Japan and Korea and Germany and Israel, they've profited greatly from that kind of economic cooperation. So it really comes down to the kinds of cooperation. And when you get into the economic warfare, very few nations have the ability to be successful, obviously because of the inability to compete both internationally and the inability to supply a simple macroeconomics to your society. You can only produce so much in your own country. Certainly trade is what absolutely advances our societies. And when you cut that trade off, you immediately put the, cramp down on the umbilical cord, and certainly anything that is denied the ability to feed itself is going to fail. And so I say, the economics is a huge player in how the Americans and their allies have squeezed countries. Look what they did to Iraq. Look what they've been doing, unfortunately, to North Korea for 60 years. By the way, the longest economic sanctions in the history of modern times, North Korea. And this is a country that, that once again, they call out as regime when, in fact, over 6 million people were murdered on that small strip of land, peninsula. And, the Americans came out with many colloquialisms that are just horrific. Carpet bombing, gook came from that. That's how they referred to the Asian individuals, because the name American was Migook. And as they were attacking Americans, they were yelling Migook. And then the Americans were obviously picking them off one by one, killing and murdering well over 5 million on that small peninsula alone. So, and that's where the word carpet bombing came from. More bombs were dropped on North Korea than in the entire World War II. So it's just let's be clear here: the true aggressors and the history of this world. The Americans will be looked upon, thousands of years from now as very similar to the conquistadors.
This is great stuff, Scott. One of the things I do enjoy most about speaking with you is how we segue into these areas. It's brilliant stuff. It really is. I'm not just saying that. I mean that sincerely. Let me put this to you, because I mean it, Scott. I don't know what I am. I don't identify as anything. I don't identify as a socialist or a liberal or a conservative. But look, I certainly would be a big supporter of the ideas of Hugo Chavez. And I want to touch on something. I want to touch on something you said a minute ago, because I think you're right. And I think it pains me to admit that you're right. Not because I have any problems with you being right, but Chavez had great but Chavez had great success early on after renationalizing the country's energy resources, and was able to show a big improvement in bringing people out of poverty. Quality of life definitely improved there, but it began to slow down round about the last couple of years, 2012, 2013, 14. I would say, you see, the mainstream media says it slowed down because what he was doing was unsustainable. But I would say that things began to get difficult because of these external influences, because of these market controls and sanctions that you described. So here's now you might disagree with that, and if you do, by all means, jump right in. But my question would be then, if countries like Venezuela renationalizing, kicking out the traitors and the globalists and the foreign enemies, if they can't get past the sanctions and the trade restrictions, surely all that's left for countries like Venezuela is to go to war. Do you know where I'm coming from?
Yeah, I don't agree with the go to war part.
I don't want anybody to go to war. Don't get me wrong. Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
No, I don't want anybody to go to war. But I'm saying, what else could
Yeah,
you
right.
do? Go ahead.
Well, so what the benefit that they have now and what they didn't have in the last almost decade was the benefit of the price of the barrel. Now, remember, the price of the barrel has been killed deliberately, and you said it, you hit it square on the head. It was the control of the market, of the oil market, that was absolutely very destructive to Venezuela. Now, with the barrel rolling back up, the Venezuelans will have a fighting chance. Certainly under Chavez, they had a much better chance. The price of the barrel, my God, it skyrocketed. I think I got up to as high as $130, $140 a barrel.
It did.
So, that was a much more easy economic community to be profitable at that time. So, you're producing a product that was 4 to 5 times more valuable than what Maduro had over the past few years. So it certainly does. When you talk about the control of the market, that's an absolute key. That's a key player. They've been playing that game against the Russians. They've been playing that game against the Iranians, and certainly right now, because of the downfall of the economic community in the West, they can't afford to play it anymore. And so you see the price of oil once again skyrocketing, and I think we're up to almost $80, $90 a barrel again.
Yeah, we're seeing petrol prices, gasoline prices, of course, as you'd say back home, rise sharply in the last month or so here, sadly for me and for everybody else. Scott Rickard is our guest, folks. We've got another 5 minutes with Scott. He's a busy man. Great to have him on. Scott, we'll finish with this. The Syrian government is saying that it's finally taken full control of Damascus and the surrounding areas. How significant is that news, Scott?
Well, it's fantastic news. I mean, here you have really a success story of a country that combined efforts with several other countries to push back a Western, really mercenary war, a proxy war that was placed upon it. And it was extremely difficult for the Syrians to do this. When you look at some of the underground infrastructure that was built by the quote-unquote ISIS, they give these mercenaries some of the most, villainous personas in order to, vilify their activities and make them look like they're unsophisticated, when in fact they're supported by some of the most sophisticated military tactics and military logistics and military engineering and infrastructure that the world has ever seen. And the fact that the Syrians were able to fight off a multinational NATO-backed force that had partners out of the Persian Gulf and had partners from around the world, even out of Libya, and certainly, unfortunately, former Irish CIA operatives. When you look at Mahdi el-Harati, whose wife, by the way, was caught with 500,000 euros in Ireland that were stolen from her, that the CIA had paid her husband to overthrow Gaddafi. These are the types of players that Syria and the Russians, the Iranians, and the Hezbollah were able to fight off. You're talking about a true David and Goliath story. Certainly, the Russians were very, I would say, my hat's off to them. I mean, it's heroism in the modern day. When you talk about the Russians, they've had to put up with World War I, World War II, Afghanistan, and now Syria. This is the West attacking the Russians. And obviously, prior to that, you had the Trotsky and his notorious individuals going after the czars. The British, the Swedes, and now the Americans have joined that allyship, and the French are participating friends, have really controlled this planet for a long time. And it's the first time in my lifetime that you've had any kind of success against the true imperialist regime that runs this planet. And it's good to see, and I hope people start to. I don't want to see the fall, and I'm not calling for the fall of England or the fall of the United States. I don't want the countries to be overthrown, but I want them to act legitimately. And I want them to take this as a message and say, look, your countries have been acting illegitimately for quite a long time here. It's time to play fairly and pay nicely in this world.
Brilliant way to end it today, Scott. Thanks for your time again today. Do come back anytime you want, my friend. When you've got something to say, just give us a message and come back on the show. Always love having you. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me again.
It's an honour. Scott Rickard live on the line there from Tampa, Florida. By the way, you can follow Scott on Twitter. It's at Scott_Rickard, Rickard. That's at Scott_Rickard, former NSA linguist and a regular contributor to Sputnik, to RT, to Press TV and many others. Top man. Check him out. Really interesting stuff there.